I want to start by applauding you on your decision not to sit in the front 2 rows. I am loud enough without a microphone. This puts a little buffer between you and me. The more enthusiastic I get, the louder I get. So I will try to move away from the microphone as I get a bit more animated in my talk. I'm here to give a somewhat more scientific view on being uniquely human than you may have had at a previous talk. And again, the goal is to come at this question from a wide variety of perspectives. And so I hope you appreciate that that is what today is intended to be. But I'm going to start by thinking back to my days in undergraduate when I took one of my favorite classes of all time, which was the philosophy of logic, and start with some basic philosophy. If P, then Q. This is a common way of stating a premise to start a logical argument. And I'm going to approach this, if P, then Q, from 2 different perspectives today. The first one will be, if it is human, then X. That will be the first part of my talk, about half of my talk. The second part of my talk, I will instead approach it from, if X, then it is human. So I will start with why I think these are going to result in different answers. And some of it has to do with philosophy of logic and logical arguments that are valid or not valid. So let's start with, if it is human, then X. For example, oh, and I apologize, when I tested this at home, my font was much bigger than that, so I'll just make sure you can read it all. If it is human, then it has a nervous system. It has a nervous system. Therefore, it is human? No. That would be a logical fallacy. Affirming the consequent is not a valid form of logic. So while I can say that if it is human, it has a nervous system, I cannot proceed to say that, well, if it has a nervous system, then it must be a human. But even if it is a logical fallacy to proceed in that direction, because many species have nervous systems, not just humans, still, it is an interesting question, is the premise true? Is it a true premise that if it is human, it has a nervous system? And the answer is yes, we have a nervous system. And so the first half of my talk is going to be looking at what are the characteristics we expect to see in a human. If it is human, then these characteristics. Remembering at all times that it is not what makes us uniquely human, because many other species also have these qualities. So the second part is where I'm going to get into perhaps maybe the good stuff. If X, then it is human. So if we look at the logical argument, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, this is logically valid, but only if our premise is true. And the question is, are there any? Are there any valid premises where I can say, if X, then it is human? I purposefully did not give you an example yet, because while I'm giving the first half of my talk, I don't want your mind racing about whether or not that second part is true. So we are going to dive in first to, if it is human, then X. If it is human, it is multicellular, has clearly defined nuclei, and eats other living things as its energy source. In other words, it is a part of the animal kingdom, and so are all of these animals. So we are a part of the animal kingdom. The characteristics that are true of the animal kingdom are true of us as humans. If it is human, then it has a spinal cord. So do many other animals. If it is human, then it is warm-blooded, bears live young, has hair or fur, and females have mammary glands that secrete milk to nourish young. This is true for most mammals. That darn platypus. But it's actually that darn platypus that then starts to get our critical thinking working. Because what do we do with exceptions? When we are trying to categorize what does it mean to be human, and we come up with a list of criteria, what are we going to do with the exceptions to that list? So let's not forget the platypus. But these mammals all fit this criteria. As far as I know, there are no wild platypus running around Ohio. So if you haven't guessed already, if you haven't had a biology class recently, I'm going through the taxonomy of human. We are in the kingdom animal. We are in the phylum Chordata, specifically the subphylum Vertebrata. We're in the class Mammalia, and we are in the order primate. So remember, King Philip called out for good soup. We're on order. We are in the order primate. And here is where students maybe didn't have this in their elementary school biology class. They maybe can't rattle off what are the criteria to be a primate versus not a primate. And that may be part because some of them are things we don't think about all the time when we look at a primate. Like we have eye sockets with a ring or cup of bone surrounding the eyes. Wow, look at me be human with my nice ring bones. But also something that is very characteristic. We think about humans and our ability to pick things up and carry things and manipulate things. These grasping hands with long fingers, and at least some of our nails are flat. And we see here in this image a variety of primates. This image does represent roughly how long ago we have had a common ancestor with these other primates. And so if we look back at the prosimians, who we haven't had a common ancestor with for a very long time, they are going to look very different. But they have those cups. They have those nice cups. We are in the family Hominidae. So these are primates with guns. We've been going to the gym. We have these well-developed forearms, and all of our nails are flat, not just some of them. And I don't know about you, but when I think like, what makes me human, I don't typically just think of like my strong upper arm muscles and my flat nails. But there are others besides humans who, I mean, look at that gorilla. He's looking pretty fit there. We are in the genus Homo. These are hominids with an S-curved spine and walk erect. And it's worth noting that of these examples, only one of them still exists today. So when we try to compare us with something that's not a human, and we want to compare ourselves with something that was as close as possible, there are no living specimens for us to compare ourselves with in this family. I also want to remind us that it is not just, oh, we are human because we walk on 2 feet, because there are lots and lots of animals that can walk on 2 feet. This dog is particularly spectacular for being able to walk on 2 feet. So it's not just, we can't in a vacuum say we are human because we walk on 2 feet. Again, if P then Q, we are just checking to see whether these are true of humans, but they are also true of many other species as well. So what makes Homo sapien different from those others in our family, in our genus? Humans have high foreheads and prominent chins. I just want to show you 2 glorious specimens of they're gorgeous Homo sapiens right there. And look at those foreheads and look at those chins. So, if we are to summarize what we learned from our biology taxonomy classes, we are multicellular, we have hair, we have an opposable thumb, we have flat nails, we walk upright, we have a high forehead, and a prominent chin. And if it is human, then we would expect to see these characteristics. I did add a few more from my biopsychology background. I wanted to go past what I might learn in a high school biology class. And I took a few from neuroscience that have also been identified as things that distinguish humans from non-humans. However, I will point out that this is looking at brain activity and behavior, and so the closest we can compare ourselves to are, for example, chimpanzees. We cannot say whether or not these neuroscience differences, how long ago these could have been found. But for some examples, if you look in our primary visual cortex, you're going to see a more complex pattern than what is found in other apes. If you look at neurons associated with empathy, feelings of guilt, and embarrassment, you're going to see more and larger of these neuron types. And if you are going to look at parts of our temporal lobe involved in language and possibly music, you would again see differences in the structures in the neuron bundles that support that parallel processing. So we can look at physiological characteristics that we can see. We can also use some of the technology available today, like MRI, and we can see that there are some differences at a cellular level. And at the end, we are going to be faced with an individual, and we are going to ask ourselves, is it human? And sometimes, even though an individual doesn't meet a lot of those criteria, or some of those criteria, or all of those criteria, we might still say, yes, this individual who is able to perform at the Paralympics and shoot an arrow with alarming accuracy without muscular forearms is absolutely 100% a human. So again, we're going to talk about what about those exceptions. And then I can just tell you that the other one is not a human. And if you don't know why, I don't want to spoil it. Not a human. So, wow, I'm going faster than I expected. I'll slow down. Part 2. Or you might be like, yes, she's already on part 2. If X, then it is a human. So let's remind ourselves of the logical argument and put in an example. Because I do get asked this. I teach an animal behavior class, and my students are like, so we're talking about animals and we're talking about humans. What would you say, Dr. Matthews, makes humans different? And I've put on the spot, and this is an answer I have come up with on the spot. This was my put me on the spot answer. If it can document knowledge for future unborn generations, then it is human. Because if you think about our ability to learn something from someone who is not alive anymore, from a YouTube video, I can learn how to make pomade and powder to create a hairstyle that was appropriate for a time period, because I want a really, exact replica, and right down to like how I style my hair. And I can find a recipe for pomade so I can do my pomade and powdering, even though nobody who pomades and powders their hair anymore is going to be able to just come and teach me. Nobody's going to be able to come over and show me in person. So we have knowledge that is not just passed down from grandparent to child to grandchild. We have information that can skip generations. We can have lost information. We can lose the ability to bake and sew and change our own oil, and then a younger generation can say, I want to take back all those skills and learn them, and my mom can't teach me. So I'm going to go to YouTube and learn how to do all of those things that used to be a part of our knowledge and isn't anymore. And that's not something you're going to see in any other species. This is something that humans do, and only humans do. So, is this an example? Like, if we're going to ask what makes us uniquely human, something that humans can do that no other species can do, is this the kind of thing we're looking for? The valid logic tells us that if the premise is true, if it is true that if it can document knowledge for future unborn generations, then it is human, then we should have an answer, and there might be many more answers to what does it mean to be uniquely human. But there's that platypus problem again. What if this is only true for modern humans? I looked it up because I actually didn't know off the top of my head how long ago did we invent writing. And it's, less than 6,000 years ago. So does that mean that 10,000 years ago, those individuals were not human? If we look back to our biology textbook that tells us how long Homo sapien has been running around, it's about 200,000 years. So does that mean we spent 195,000 years unable to write and 5,000 years able to write? And that we could decide that being able to write is somehow something that makes us human? And what about the 2-year-old who can't write yet? Are they human? And is it only true for average humans? There are going to be people for a wide range of reasons cannot read and cannot write. And what a terrible thing it would be to consider them anything less than human. So here's a list of things that don't make us human. And this is the kind of laundry list that shows up in any good animal behavior textbook, where we take an example of what it might mean to be human and we say, nope, here's a species that does that. So I almost made my entire talk on this list, because it is what my grad school exams were made of. Things that don't make us human. It's not culture. So while I talk about passing knowledge on from a dead person to somebody, say, 200 years later, this is referring to the trickling down of ways of doing things, of information amongst living individuals. So you might have, for example, one member of a species figure out how to crack a specific nut or solve some other problem. And typically the first individuals to learn are going to be that individual's offspring. That individual's offspring spends a lot of time with mom. Mom is cracking these nuts in a completely unique way. And so the first individuals that are likely to learn how to crack this nut are going to be the offspring. And then often there is some lateral learning where the playmates of those children also learn how to crack this nut. But it's not going to take too long before you might have this entire social group cracks their nuts in that very unique way. But 300 miles away, that exact same species has never figured out how to crack the nut. They might not be eating that food source at all. And so we have something that can pass from generation to generation. It is a unique way of behaving, and it is something that is characteristic for the members of that particular group, not the entire species, and other groups do things differently. Culture has absolutely been documented in a variety of non-humans. Speech, all you need is a parrot to know that we are not the only individuals that engage in speech. And then you start getting, okay, let's get more technical about it. Do we mean the ability to put together a unique grammatical sentence with syntax? Like, does it matter if me tickle is different than tickle me? Like, Does that language have to have that level of sophistication? And every time we try to raise the bar on, well, okay, you can do that, but a real human, we often find an example that meets that. I'm not saying that animals are out there, you know, standing at podiums giving talks on what does it mean to be a chimpanzee, but there are lots of examples of speech. Agriculture. So when we talk in my animal behavior class and I ask them, are we still evolving? Like we go over the timeline and the history and Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years, and I'm like, are we identical to the Homo sapiens from 100,000 years ago? And are we still changing? They're often not sure. They don't want to answer. They feel like they have a gut answer, and they feel like I'm trapping them and that their gut answer is wrong. And from an evolutionary perspective, one of the examples we give of a more recent evolutionary adaptation in humans is the ability to process lactose. It's only been around for about 10,000 years. So humans have only been able to tolerate and digest lactose for about 10,000 years, and it coincides with many of the things we see with agriculture. If I am a nomad and I live here where I have food sources and it's winter time and I now have to travel somewhere else where I have food sources, if I can actually have a food source like a goat that produces milk and take it with me, I gain all of this ability to be able to move more easily. And then if I can plant things and make the land work wherever I am. But ants also engage in agriculture. Here by tools, I mean tool use, tool making. In fact, when I was a kid, I wanted to be the next Jane Goodall who lived in the jungle and wrote about tool use and chimpanzees. I thought she was spectacular. Then I realized that you don't get to be around people very much in the middle of nowhere, and I need people. But I picked crows because I wanted a variety for my list, and because, oh my gosh, they're so fascinating. Like watching a crow pick up a rock and drop it into a tube of water so that the seeds float higher and they can get the seeds, and shortening strings and pulling on levers. Just, it's a rabbit hole. You could spend hours and hours just watching crows and other corvids doing really cool things with tools, making tools, using tools. Bees are just fascinating, and their level of cooperation is just phenomenal. The collecting of the pollen, the tending to the hive, the feeding the queen and the larvae, the entire process requires that individuals have different jobs. One of the things my students often find interesting when we cover this in animal behavior is it's not like you are born with one job and then that's your job. You are not a pollen collecting bee from birth and always collecting pollen for the rest of your life. You actually go through stages. And first you're stuck cleaning out the larvae cells, and then maybe you're on babysitting duty, and going out and collecting pollen is your kind of last hurrah, which is good, because if you die out there, you're not going to come back and do the other jobs. So it's the last job that you do towards the end of your 21 day whirlwind. So you think people change careers often. 21 days, tried it all. An ability to recognize ourselves in a mirror. So that idea that we have a sense of self, that we understand that we are different than others. We have this theory of mind. I could steal a cookie and then walk through the room with it hidden behind my back, and I don't think I'm somehow getting away with something because I know that I know that you know that I have a cookie behind my back. I have a sense of I am an individual and my perspective on the world is different than the perspective of other individuals. And if you take an odorless paint and put it on my forehead and let it dry and have a control group where you take an odorless paint that has no color whatsoever and put it on their foreheads, and then you put us all in front of a mirror and let us gawk at ourselves. Dolphins don't have hands, so they don't do this, but chimpanzees will look in the mirror and try to figure out what that is on their forehead. Whereas my dog sees himself in the mirror and he's just like, friend, 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 and tries to play with it, tries to bite it. So we do have other species that have an ability to recognize ourselves in a mirror. But probably my favorite one for this list, because I have been up here bemoaning the difficulty of categorizing anything, is that categorizing things isn't even something that is uniquely human. Vervets have a distinct alarm call for eagle, and it is absolutely different than if there is a turkey vulture overhead, because an eagle is dangerous and they should stop doing whatever they're doing and get to safety. But a turkey vulture is not, and so they are wasting energy if they run and hide when it's just a turkey vulture. And so they can categorize things as eagles and turkey vultures and communicate that information to others. So, if we do want to explore this idea of what can humans do that other species can't, as I said, my passing knowledge on to future generations, that was one I came up with, like, when put on the spot. But there are lots of experts who have spent way more time thinking critically about this. And so I just want to recommend 2 sources, and they're like quick, here's how humans are different. So the first is an article in Scientific American. And one of the nice things about this article in the Scientific American is it's just a 15-minute read. Who knows, maybe this could be added to like future 179 reading lists. It's a 15-minute read on the origin of the mind. And reading from the excerpt, the first step in figuring out how the human mind arose is determining what distinguishes our mental processes from those of other creatures. Because at the end of the day, it is our cortex that is more different than our closest relatives. It is the part that allows us to problem solve and think in a wide variety of ways, and is probably the best place to look for that thing that makes us uniquely human. And Hauser gave this list of 4 things: generative computation, promiscuous combination of ideas, scandalous, the use of mental symbols, and abstract thought. So in Scientific American, I can send the link out to anyone who wants it. I recommend this 15-minute read on what does it mean to be human. And if you want something longer than a 15-minute read, we have by Sudenhoff, the book is called The Gap, The Science of What Separates Us from Other Animals. And his list is open-ended ability to imagine and reflect on different situations, and our deep-seated drive to link our scenario-building minds together. But as is a longer text, he even starts to hedge his own responses by giving examples from the animal world where they start down that direction. So rats, we believe, can plan ahead and consider options in a familiar maze. And great apes can think about hidden movements, use human-made symbols, and imagine alternative mental scenarios. But only at the age of about 1.5 and a 2-year-old. So again, I can now go back to all of those other, like tool use, language, speech, culture, and say, all right, but can they do it as well as a human? They can do these things, but can they do it as well as a human? So I can run, but I'm no cheetah. I can smell, but I'm no dog. So the fact that I can run and the fact that I can smell don't make me just like a cheetah and just like a dog. They are far superior to me in those areas. And so as we think about some of these things that might be the answer to, what makes us uniquely human, perhaps we should say, just being able to do it a little bit is not enough. If they can't do it fully the way we see in humans, then we can still cling to this as something that makes us uniquely human. But again, we are back to the issue that categorizing anything is really difficult. So, I have a final answer. This is my push comes to shove. I've done the research to put together this talk. What is my answer for you are human if it's gonna be unsatisfying? A human sperm fertilized a human egg to create you. That is my answer. That when we talk about speciation in a biology class, we talk about whether because of behavioral barriers or physical barriers, they are no longer able to mate and create viable offspring. That is when we start to differentiate them as different species. And so, if I am a human, then I must come from a human sperm and a human egg. That is what makes me human. So, as I wrap up this talk and prepare for questions, as we think about what makes us uniquely human, as we listen to talks throughout the semester about what makes us uniquely human, as we think about what makes us uniquely human from a wide variety of classes, let's also spend some time thinking about some other questions, like what makes us unique humans? Because I think that's also a really important and interesting question that we can ask. And that's what I have for you today. I will tell you, I have additional slides prepared for questions I think I'm going to get, and I will be disappointed if I spent all this time making them and nobody asks these questions. But it'll also be okay. Because you might surprise me with something I haven't thought of. Yes?
When you talk about culture for the chimpanzee, how do you define culture?
You're asking me to come up with, here, I'm going to back up and say that that is always the first step, is defining it. And so what happens is you will have an animal behaviorist say, given this definition of culture, then here is this animal example. And so I would have to read carefully for a paper, because it's been demonstrated in a variety of species. Like in dolphins, how was it defined? In chimpanzees, how was it defined? And is that not satisfying? Absolutely. And so it is good that there is, after the first article, after the dozenth article, there starts to be some consensus. If we are going to say that culture exists in animals, this is what we mean by it. And then there can be pushback from the human literature that that's not what we mean by culture. So I will say that I refuse to be pinned to a, we really get nitpicky about word choice when making a definition, and I'm off the top of my head not ready to here is the agreed upon definition. But it does have to do with the transmission of knowledge and behaviors through generations that is different in other groups, other social groups of the same species. Kind of. That's my best off the top of my head. I did not have a slide with definition of culture on it. Dag nabbit. relies on soft tissue that I cannot.
So don't we have exactly the same problem with primitive Homo sapiens?
Oh, yeah. So when I give this data from neuroscience, let's be very clear, that's in the last 2 decades. What if the neurons of a Homo sapien from 2007 is completely different from the neurons of a Homo sapien from, I don't know, the 1700s? We don't know. There are some preserved brains that we might be able to look at some things, but yeah, it's a problem.
I'm thinking even behaviors, right? So Sudendorf's definition basically sounded like it was the storytelling one, right?
Yeah.
Narratives, but we don't know whether Homo sapiens was telling stories 180 million years, 180,000 years ago.
I agree. And so I think that when we try to list characteristics that define humans, I think we have to say we're talking about modern humans. We are talking about, because, I'm going to use one of my things, even though it's not quite, I'm gonna. All right, because I'm proud of it. Not this one. Not that one. Yes, that one. First of all, I found that picture of my mother like 2 days ago, and I did a double take because I was like, oh my gosh, that's a picture of me. So, yeah. Human egg. Human. What about the first human? So I'm going to use this to answer your question, even just what about a human today versus a human from 10,000 years ago? What about a human 10,000 years ago compared to a human 100,000 years ago? Like, at what moment do you say this version is a human? So, I had fun putting this together. I spent way too much time putting this together. All right, can we all agree that that is a black square? Raise your hand if you would agree that that is a black square. I want you to, color, I get that my it's a projection of what's intended. That's a black square. Raise y'all's hands, because that is a black square. I want you to put your hand down when it is no longer a black square. So go ahead and get those hands in the air if you think that is a black square. You ready? Think all the hands are down? I want to know now, raise your hand when you think it's a white square. When we define a human, we have to recognize that these are human names, or human-derived categories that have some basis to them. Like for me to be a human, I had to come from the egg and the sperm that were also humans, but then their egg and sperm had to come from, like, when is a human born from two individuals who are not human? And if the answer is never, then when was the first human? And so I want to point out that this process is not a today you are a human and 200,000 years ago you are not a human, and that it was this jump from there. It is a continuous process. And to be clear, I am sure that we have lots of remnants of our previous ancestors. We have just a few white squares that differentiate us from our ancestors, and I'm willing to bet there's some pink squares working their way in there, and that one day this might all turn into a pink square, and we don't have a name for that thing, that we are constantly experiencing changes in our environment, that change have influence on genetics, that have an influence on our behavior, has an influence on who reproduces and who doesn't, which has an influence on the genetics of the next generation. And so my definition of human is extremely temporary. Any other questions? I'll put one in there for you, John. Go ahead, Jeremy.
So just like we can maybe hedge about the past, the distant past, we can also hedge because we haven't yet discovered or encountered life outside of this planet. So there's another possibility that we might at some point encounter.
If we go all Star Trek and encounter another humanoid, like what are the characteristics that they have that are different than us? Or if you go back to my image of the blonde woman in the red dress, and I said she is not a human, like, is there a day when we will consider someone who is a robot? Sorry, spoiler. And not from a human egg and a human sperm, but meets every single one that didn't know she was a robot. She passed as a human for a very long time before it was discovered. Television show, Battlestar Galactica. So is there some future where we can no longer distinguish between humans and non-humans because we've done such a good job of mimicking what it means to be human in something that we create, not is fertilized and born, and then how do we have to shift our definition of what does it mean to be human to account for that? Or are we going to someday embrace these individuals that are our creation and say, you are also part of humanity, which was pretty much the entire premise of Battlestar Galactica, is like, are they human? Do they deserve to be considered human? So yeah. All right, John, I'm gonna put in your, is it a chair? I did want to say that these issues about how do you create a category are not new, and there is an entire field of cognitive psychology. Philosophers, including Aristotle, have wrestled with, like, how do we categorize things? And so I just had to ask, like, if it's a beanbag and doesn't have 4 legs, is it still a chair? If it's broken and nobody can sit in it, if the function is gone, is it still a chair? And that there are lots of theories about how you might make those decisions about what is or isn't a part of the category. Yeah.
I'm amazed that your list of items when you were going through this species, this one species.
And when you get to the one that's just us, it's a high forehead and a sharp chin, like this.
Well, but in that list, you can find other animals that do those visual things.
It's the combination.
What about the combination?
Yeah, you have to have all of the but you don't have to have all of the predecessors. Like, you might not be able to walk erect, and you are still a human. So you might not look like the exemplar where you compare something, like, I have a specific human in mind, and the more like that human you are, the more likely I am to call you a human. Or maybe I have an average example across all of the humans I've ever met, and how close are you to that average, versus having some set of rules or criteria, and you have to meet so many of those criteria. Do you have the essence of what it means to be human? Like, the number of conversations that have been had about how do we categorize anything is an interesting lecture. And that's true even if you're just talking about trying to say whether or not something's a chair. We've got 2 on the wall over there that have been deemed not chair. So categorizing a chair is hard. How much harder is it to categorize what does it mean to be a human? And that's what makes it an interesting conversation to have 4 times a year, every 4 years, and in 10 different sections of 179 every year, because there are so many ways to try to answer that question. This was just one. This was a very science-y, biologically driven, my background, how would I approach that question?
What about making art? Like, you talk about symbolic.
Do you know how much elephant art goes for? Oh my gosh.
That was my question, is are there animals that...
But Now we can ask, what is art? And we can ask, if I have used basic animal training techniques to teach an elephant to hold a brush in its trunk and dip it into paints and swirl it around, is that any different than training the elephant to turn in circles or stand up on its hind legs or take a bow? And if the answer is no, then are all of those things art, or is it just somehow the paint on a canvas that makes it art? So I can't do a very good job of defining culture. I can't do a very good job of defining art. I can't do a very good job of defining what a chair is. And yet here I am pretending that I can define what it means to be human. It is a difficult task we are asking ourselves to do. Yeah?
So, you mentioned how a lot of times everyone uses robots as an example or virtual devices. It goes beyond the AI discussion to how we're closer and closer to have past the first F-35. So, for those who may not know, the difference is that we are unable to distinguish the activities of AI in many instances against the human.
Yeah.
And I'm curious of your thoughts on going forward, what that looks like. Something in my discussion to some degree that perhaps the thought that the next stage of human evolution to some extent is AI.
I have two answers for you. One, what a great segue for our St. Albert's talk coming up later this year, where we have someone who is addressing the what does it mean to be human from a perspective that includes a look at AI. So come to that talk. Secondly, I will say that one of the things that's different about my Caprica 6 from Galactica robot example is that there was not a slow progression of almost human, almost human, almost human, almost human her. In fact, the progression is really toaster, Roomba, the Cylon that walks around and like shoots things, the one that's a spacecraft, and then like the flesh-covered model is a progression of robots, not part of a progression of humans. But to your point still, we hit a point where we can't tell apart the answers from a computer. We don't know, is it a computer responding or is it a person typing those responses? And we can't tell the difference. It passes the Turing test. We can't tell, am I talking to a computer or am I talking to a human? Then the question is, do we change then our definition of what it means to be human so that we can tell them apart again? Or do we rely on some other part of our definition of what does it mean to be human to separate them? And at the end of the day, this is an issue that researchers, particularly in the social sciences, face all the time. How do I define the thing that I want to measure? And that is one of the most difficult steps in research.
Well, I think it's maybe now that it's a whole series, right, about the importance of studying really truly interdisciplinary view on this complicated question. So, I mean, you can do the biopsychosocial view. You can also add in what's on the kind of faith reason word that I believe in a few weeks ago. So I'm thinking about the broken chair and created from human sperm and lead.
Yeah.
You can go back to, well, what is the purpose in being created?
Mm-hmm.
So the broken chair has the purpose of being a chair, so no matter what state it's in, it's still a chair.
Even if it can no longer serve that function.
Even if it's correct. And what is our purpose in being human? But it sort of all falls apart with AI, because I can create something for the purpose of making human.
Yeah. But I could step backwards from that and say, does evolution have a goal, and was human the goal, and so our purpose is what? Right.
Well, that's what I'm pulling in a faith-based
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
Acted by itself. So,  'cause, 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 '
Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So when I showed the animation to John, he asked me, he's like, well, where's the halfway point? And I'm like, I didn't even calculate that. But I can tell you that when I was creating it, and I was trying to make where the dots disappeared or showed up from be as random as possible, and I know from a statistical point of view that what we think of as random, as evenly spread out as possible, is not random, and so I was trying not to do that. And as I was thinking about which square to make white next, I reached a point where I was deciding which black square to take away next. And it happened like almost instantaneously from one slide to the next, and completely caught me off guard that I had gone from adding white squares to taking away black squares in like an instant. Yeah. Yes.
Because there's a black square there all along, and you're just layering over it a template that reveals.
Yeah. And if you want to know, I took a grid in Excel, and I made all the squares the same size, and I painted them all black, and then I took freeze frames and then made them, yeah. So you can see why I wanted to use it, whether somebody asked the question or not. We are out of time, and there are cookies and drinks and beverages and more conversations about this to be had as the semester goes on. I was worried I was going too fast, but you guys did a great job of holding up your part of the bargain and helping me flesh out the hour with some really great questions, and I appreciate your participation.